to see everyone. Welcome. My name is Louise. I am the Division Chair of STR, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this conversation on impact in strategic management research. This year at STR, we are running several events under the theme of impact and relevance. That's why we have this nice background with impact and relevance. And this is the second last in the series that we're going to run this year online. We're going to run the final event at the end of June on collecting impactful data. So please keep an eye out for that event. And then we're going to round up our conversations at the STR plenary at the conference in Chicago. I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting conversation today. And thank you very much to all of you for being here. Thank you to Julia Bodner of CBS for co-organizing and hosting this session. Now, before I say a little bit more about the topic, I would like to introduce our two distinguished speakers today. We are very grateful that Professors Gary Hamel and Anita McGahan are taking the time to talk to us today. Gary Hamel has been on the faculty of the London Business School for more than 30 years and is the director of the Management Lab. He's one of the world's most influential business thinkers and has worked with leading companies across the globe. He's a highly sought-after management speaker. He's also written numerous books and published influential articles in strategic management on competition, strategic intent, core competencies, and more recently on management innovation. Anita McGahan is the professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto and a professor of strategic management at the Rotman School of Management, where she also holds the George E. Connell Chair in Organizations and Society. Her research is focused on private entrepreneurship in the public interest, and she's written numerous articles on industry change, sustainable competitive advantage, and the establishment of new field. An area that's of particular interest to Anita is global health and the diffusion of knowledge across international boundaries. Anita is also a leading thinker in strategic management, and she's received numerous awards, also from STR, for her research, teaching, and her service to the field. Welcome to you both. We're very honored that you are here. So let me say a little bit more about the theme that we're going to talk about today. Strategy scholars, and I think scholars also more broadly, are increasingly being pushed to show that they have impact in strategic management. But it's not always clear what impact means and how we might have impact as researchers. We have invited Anita and Gary here to talk about impact in strategic management, as this is a topic that you've both been quite outspoken about. Gary recently wrote a piece in Strategic Management Review on the case for reimagining management research. I'm going to put a link to that in the chat. And Anita also recently contributed to the online impact salon that's been organized by Laurie Rosenkopf of Wharton. So welcome to you, and thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us today. We're going to have a conversation. We'll have some time at the end for questions. So those of you who are here attending, please put some questions in the chat or note your questions, and we will allow for questions and some interaction at the end. So I wanted to ask Gary and Anita, what does impact actually mean for the field of strategic management? And Julia, maybe you could stop sharing the slide.
Yeah, please go ahead, Anita.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Louisa and Julia for organizing, to all of you for being here today. It's a great honor for me to be with you under any circumstances, but especially with Gary Hamel. It's wonderful to talk with you about these ideas, Gary. So just a couple of quick thoughts to kick us off, and then maybe, Louisa, you could tell us what you feel might be of greatest interest to the community. Gary and I were reminiscing just a minute ago about how we met, and I think it was through Kostas Markides, who was a classmate of mine at Harvard Business School a million years ago, and a million years for me. It was only a few years ago for Kostas, but he often says his research, his early research, for example, was tremendously managerially relevant, but only for about 10 minutes of conversation with a CEO. In other words, he could talk about something pretty narrow for a long time, but he didn't have a lot of breadth that he was developing through his specific publishable research studies that would be of great interest to a CEO, say. So he knew a lot about something that was pretty circumscribed, And he knew a lot about other things too, but his research was really leading him to narrowness. And I think that that problem of narrowness has been compounded in our field as we've searched for depth, with the revolution sort of around empirical identification that has happened over the last couple of years. We've even become resistant to providing managerial advice or managerial implications in our papers out of concern that there's selection into our data sets of companies that want to do something. So the advice that we might give a company may not reflect its initial conditions, or its situation may be considerably more complex, let's say, than the ones that we're actually able to instrument on in a particular setting. So this tension kind of is coming up between managerial relevance and impact of our work and its publishability, its claim to generate knowledge. And I think that's a terrible shame. And I think, Gary, you've been a champion of overcoming that kind of problem. Can I turn to you now? How have you done what you've done, come up with these amazingly important core constructs like core competence and, you know, all your work on corporate strategy and everything you're doing now on innovation, that have become foundational in papers, but really, I think for you, as I think of it, really those ideas really have their genesis in your connection to practice. Can I ask you your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Anita, thank you. A lovely introduction. Also taking me back a few years. It's actually been 40 years on the faculty of London Business School. I hate to admit that. Yeah, let me some really quick framing thoughts. This is a super deep subject and one that I'm deeply passionate about. So you might have to cut me off, but a few quick thoughts. I think kind of the first question to ask is like, what is the role of management scholars anyway? And you know, I look at it in a very practical way. You know, management, you know, broadly defined, you know, how we mobilize and organize resources to productive ends. You could argue that management is humankind's most important social technology, that our ability to do anything, whether it's running the back office of a bank, mounting a mission to Mars, you know, improving healthcare, ultimately depends on this ability to bring people together and improve and do amazing things collectively. So if you start with that perspective, you take this super seriously. And you take your role as a management thinker or scholar very, very seriously as well. And I think you tend to judge that in terms of how am I helping the people who are every day out there trying to, you know, move our world forward. So I think that's kind of a starting point. If you think about your role narrowly, or you think about it just in the context of academia, you kind of miss that in a way. And I think, you know, I'll maybe be a little provocative, you know, business schools, we're basically dental schools, or we're engineering schools, right? We're trying to do something quite practical, quite impactful. You know, we're not theoretical physicists. I have a stepdaughter who just finished her PhD at Stanford in theoretical chemistry. I can tell you that's a very, very different kind of field. So number one, I think how you look at this field depends really on what you think your role is and what you think your value is, number one. Number two, in terms of impact, I tend to think about the knowledge we create in a few different ways. I mean, yes, it has to be rigorous. You know, we have to have strong causality. You have to have truth claims that you think can stand up. But for me, there's four things that are important. You know, one is the knowledge we're producing novel? Is it non-incremental? Is it frame breaking? Is it more than kind of an unnecessary complex reinstatement of you know what a smart practitioner would already know? Number two, is it timely, right? Does it speak to some kind of, or let me say maybe problem focused would be a better way. Does it speak to some essential challenge or problem that's facing a good share of, you know, the world's institutions? Is it actionable? You know, does it come with a handle attached? Can I make sense of, okay, what do I do with this knowledge? And in a way, is it catalytic? Is it likely to yield some kind of nonlinear improvements in organizational performance? So when I read anything, those are the lenses, you know, is it new? Is it clearly problem focused? Is there some action potential here? And you know, is it catalytic in some way? And I think a lot of you know, management research maybe doesn't meet those criteria. And I'll end with one kind of final little thought here. You know, if you think about in any field of human endeavor, if you think about a knowledge structure, and you know, this is just my conception, so I don't know whether this holds up or not. You can decide. but kind of at the top, you have your worldview, like really deep assumptions about what are organizations for, why do people go to work, you know, what's the moral foundations for capitalism, but big worldview kinds of questions. Those paradigmatic perspectives point you to certain problems and away from other problems. So if your problem, as it was for a lot of management researchers 100 years ago, or practitioners, how do you build more efficient organizations? That points you to particular problems around scale and compliance and so on. Those problems then point you towards principles. Okay, so what principles will help us solve those problems? So if your problem 300 years ago was to think about self-government, and you start with this proposition of individual sovereignty, and that takes you to this problem of self-government, well, then you end up with a set of principles around one person, one vote, and legislative assemblies, and freedom of speech, and so on. Those principles in turn over time get embedded in a set of processes. In the case of democracy, how do you hold an election, or how do you appeal a judicial ruling, which then define everyday practices and finally performance. And I think the same thing is true in management as well, right? There's deep paradigmatic beliefs. What is strategy? Why do companies need strategy? That point you to a certain set of problems. Then you go searching, okay, how might I solve those, and so on. And here's what I'll end with, just this quick thought. I think that one of the challenges I see in a lot of research is that very seldom do we challenge the worldview, do we challenge those paradigmatic beliefs. And as Thomas Kuhn and others said, the only way you get fundamental progress is you have to go back and really interrogate and challenge kind of those taken for granted beliefs. So very few articles do that, but also very few get down to the level of processes and practices and action. So they're caught in some kind of weird middle ground. And so what I often say to young scholars is, if your research is neither profound nor practical, like, people aren't going to pay attention to it. So a couple of quick ideas to get us started.
Thank you very much for that. Anita, please go ahead and respond. That's
I'm
fine.
sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Please take us in whatever direction you want, Louise.
No, I could tell that you wanted to respond, so you're welcome to go ahead. Otherwise,
well, I wanted to ask Gary just a little bit about that. So there's two thoughts that came to mind as you were going through this helpful framework and kind of contextualizing us around this way of thinking about what management is in the first place. And you of course elevated to our attention the importance of doing things that are practical and that can make a difference to people who are actually trying to practice management and at the same time be conforming to an important worldview. What do you worry at all about sort of a kind of consulting forward promotion of frameworks and ideas that maybe ring true in a particular context that a practitioner / educator wants to monetize through some sort of connection to business schools, and where the framework isn't grounded in anything that, let's say, the editors of our journals would recognize as testable or kind of robustly proven as really solid ways of thinking about how action should be designed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, boy, that's a really deep, thoughtful question, Anita, and I may not have a good answer. I mean, I think the question of is it grounded can be answered in a couple of ways. One is it grounded in reality? Is it a good description of what we see in organizations?
Yeah.
When we go in and we look at multiple organizations or different industries of different types, does this particular finding hold up, right? And I think, that kind of rigor is super, super important. But within that perspective on grounded and testability and so on is an assumption. And the assumption is that the researcher is there to understand and to describe. And that's, clearly important. Description is the beginning of science. But I would also argue the goal of the researcher is to build. The goal of the researcher is to invent. And I think, there's two kinds of research. There's science that is about inquiry, and obviously, describing phenomenon, positing relationships, demonstrating causality, and so on is all super important. But at some point, if you're going to do any good, you kind of have to move from inquiry to innovation, right? identifying deficiencies in current systems, building solutions, testing those, and so on. So I think there's another way of getting at rigor, which is, you know, building something and trying it and testing it and see what kinds of results you get, you know, which is, you know, what engineers do all the time. And, you know, one of the things that got, the reason I started thinking about this is when I relocated from London, where I lived full time for quite a while, and I relocated here to Silicon Valley not many decades ago. And I started hanging out with people at Stanford, not in the business school, but in, you know, life sciences and engineering and computer sciences. What struck me was they were all in the thrall of some really interesting problem. So if you look at Stanford, and I'm just taking them as an example, I think you'll probably find the same thing at MIT, and you could find something at Cambridge and so on. But if you look at Stanford, they have a whole set of centers: Center for Biodesign, Genome Technology Center, Nanoscience Prototyping Laboratory, Center for Molecular Medicine, blah, 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 blah. When you go and you look at, and these are all very well-funded, very research-focused, you know, very credible research institutes, and out of these come a whole lot of papers. But if you go look at the mission of these, and which I did, you know, of how they talk about their goal, you see things like developing tools, designing solutions, creating instruments, pursuing breakthroughs, identifying technologies, creating prototypes, and so on. I never hear that language inside of business schools. So, you know, the way I've tended, and by the way, if you want to do something that's truly new and breakthrough, probably you're not going to find a phenomenon that fits that inside of an existing organization. Like you're not going to get there by describing the status quo. And so my approach has been, hey, let me try something. Let me start with a proposition that seems to make sense, that can be very theoretically based, but you know, I don't find it in nature as something that currently exists. Let's go try that in an organizational setting, see what we learn, and you know, see if our hypotheses are true or not. So I think what has often been missing from my perspective in management research is kind of genuine experimentation. And I don't mean torturing some MBA students in a behavioral lab. I mean inside of very complex organizations, working on really bleeding edge problems, developing potentially new solutions, and seeing if, you know, and then drawing results. So I think that's another approach, you know, experimental results. And obviously a lot of scientific insights have come when you do experiments, you get anomalous results, and you go like, okay, like, you know, that's basically how management research started with the Hawthorne experiment, right? But I find that we've kind of lost that, and we spend all of our time describing what is and very little effort imagining what could be. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's how I've tried to think about it.
I think that's a good answer. Thank you both. I'm hearing a little bit about it. It's almost like, I think, Anita, the way you started out and you're talking about what you had been discussing, or you're thinking about this discussion with Costas on breadth versus depth. And I'm hearing you say a little bit, it's almost like it's a trade-off. Either we do the empirical identification, we do the selection, we publish in the A journals, we deal with the rigor. Alternatively, it's more we deal with the relevance, but then it's difficult for us to deal with the rigor at the same time. I hear Gary say, well, maybe it doesn't have to be a trade-off, right? There are other ways in which we could maybe approach problems, or thinking about approaching problems. And then perhaps it would be possible for us to think about the rigor and the relevance at the same time. I don't know, what do you think? Is it a trade-off, the way we've normally posed it, or are there ways for us to overcome this?
So, Louisa, thank you. So I think the answer is yes, 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 yes. You mentioned at the outset that many of the scholars who are here may be junior scholars. They may be, you know, PhD students or assistant professors. Perhaps it's hard to think of anybody more impactful or famous than Gary Hamel. So it's likely that most people here are you know, getting going in their careers, or a little bit more toward the beginning than perhaps you are, Gary, and certainly for better or worse than me. So let me just say that one of the things that I've noticed among the young people that I interact with in my classrooms and in our PhD program and so on is that there is a tremendous awareness and concern in my classrooms about the problems in the world. about environmental and climate issues, around the imperative of social justice, about concerns, about equity and inclusion, and concerns about quality of life, and how innovation and for example, around AI or quantum is going to affect the array of jobs that are available, career tracking, and a range of other really very broad supra-organizational transnational problems that face those of us who live in this century. And I think there's an appetite in the field of management for confronting those problems. I think we're past the point of debating their relevance to the field, and we do strongly believe that we need to channel our energy toward addressing really significant problems of our time. I was just talking or interacting this morning with Joe Mahoney, who's working, of course, on prisons and forced labor. These are critical questions for management, and they're critical questions for society. Okay, so we've got, I think, a lot of momentum there. I think there's also an awareness that we do have a heritage in strategy that, for better or worse, and sometimes it's for better and sometimes it's for worse, of an emphasis on contributing to knowledge by making strong causal claims. Our field, which emerged really from business policy in the 70s and 80s, and has continued to develop, has sought theoretical insights, and that, I can speak as an editor of one of our journals, that has been a priority in publications, especially, I would say, over the last sort of 10 or 20 years, is to really think carefully about knowledge production against a set of criteria that reflect robust causality and causal claims. And, there's a tremendous tension here, because when you have system level problems, when you have climate problems, when you have many of the firms that are complicit in creating the climate crisis, let's say, large scale agricultural processing of cows and pigs, companies that are involved in this kind of activity are part of the problem that we don't fully understand, but we know needs solving. And so, trying to advise the managers of companies that are complicit in creating problems that they should change them is like, pushing on a string, right? It's not, we need to be able to create more kinds of knowledge than only knowledge about how managers can be more effective what they're doing. We need to be able to question what they're doing and its legitimacy in the first place. And I can see you nodding, Gary, and I'm super interested in what you think about this. But so for me, I, at a fundamental level, think our purpose is I do not, I guess I suppose I do not think that the role of management scholars is to improve or advise managers on as our foundation. I think I think we should do that sometimes. I think we should be eclectic. I think there are some people who are very motivated to do that, and my view would be, God bless them. That's between them and their conscience. That's what they do. That I respect that. But for me, I also want to engage with the question of what constitutes a constructive social impact through organized action. And I think of organizations, as Gary said, as tools for getting things done. And if a firm can't perform, then we need a new firm, or we need some other organizational structure to accomplish that. Let me stop there. Gary, what do you think?
No, boy, I'm 100% on board with that. First of all, and I think I would hope this is how my work in organizations has been a bit different than maybe, somebody working at a consulting company. I never start by asking, what does this company think its problem is? because often they're trapped in old paradigmatic beliefs. They do not have that broader view of the challenges facing society, and they may have a very narrow, self-interested, and not very inspiring sense of what their problems are. So you need to start, whatever you are, by reframing the problem and making sure we're like working on things that are truly important. Some years ago back, I think about I can't even remember, 2018 something or other. I brought a bunch of scholars and CEOs together for a couple of days, and we put together a thing around moonshots for managers, and things that would be super difficult, and things that like very few executives are saying, yeah, that's the problem that I have on my plate right now. So number one, no, our client is not some particular company or manager, for sure. They may be kind of willing to open their organization up for research, but they're not really the client for sure. I do think that ultimately the client, if you like, is a problem. It's and as you say, if you look at some of the challenges that are right now facing humanity, you talked about Southern, whether it's state-backed cybercrime, whether it is growing income inequality, whether it's global indebtedness, whether it's societal polarization, whether it is healthcare that's bankrupting economies around the world, whether it's human trafficking, lack of sanitation, a long list of problems. These are not going to be solved by single individuals. As I think you were saying, Anita, they are cross jurisdiction, politically fraught, culturally embedded, and we need institutions and collaboration across institutions to address these. And so, what has really driven a lot of my work from very early in my career was really trying to understand what are the kind of deeply embedded institutional incompetencies that you see around the world, that our large institutions tend to be incremental, they tend to be inertial, they tend to be kind of innovation phobic, they tend to be very disengaging. And, I certainly believe that we're at a point in society where we simply need organizations that are substantially more capable than the ones we have right now. So I think if, and let me bring that back to the question you talked about at the beginning about being narrow. Yeah, any one of us, we only have so much time in the world, right? We can only tackle like so much. We can't boil the ocean. But I would say that if your research is embedded within a much bigger problem, even if you only can work on a part of it, you will make an interesting contribution, and people will be grateful for what you did, because you can't solve the whole thing, but you're giving them some sense of what might be possible or how to move forward. So by definition, we're all going to be probably somewhat narrow. But if I'm going to be narrow, I want to be narrow working on a really important challenge rather than one that's kind of fairly trivial. And I do think that a lot of the field, we've suffered from a kind of ADD, a kind of ambition deficit disorder, where we just increment forward. We're not really working from those problems forward, as you were saying. We're not really thinking deeply about how our institutions are screwed up and incapable of addressing these problems and why. So yeah, you're 100% right. I would say on this question of trade-off, I remember reading something by Daft and Lewin, I think, who basically said it is unrealistic to aspire to both practical relevance and, relevance within the academy. I 100% disagree. I think it's complete rubbish. And I have to say a little bit arrogant as well, because I think there's been this view in some quarters that kind of, knowledge trickles down, that, we do all this really deep research and then, maybe people will pick it up practically. That's not really our concern. Let's not worry about it. If it happens, great. We do not have the right to waste society's resources on research that doesn't matter. My wife is an obstetrician, and the leading journal in her field, I can't even remember what it's called, but it's Obstetrics and Gynecology, I guess. It's where all the top researchers publish. The goal of that journal is to improve the practice of women's health. The goal of the Academy of Management is to improve the profession of management. I don't think there's any such thing as a profession of management. There's people who are managers, but we don't have a profession like lawyers or physicians. There's no profession of management. And it should be, we need to improve the practice of managing, which is completely separate than somebody called a manager. So I don't think there's any reason that our journals and our work can't be as absolutely, and I can tell you, every obstetrician, they read these journals, every single time they come out. Good science, working from the future backwards. Like, why can't we be relevant? But so I think just those are two thoughts. I think you have to start with a worthy problem that inspires you, that ensures your work is likely to have impact. But don't think that there's some, fundamental trade-off between work that's academically robust and work that will make a difference.
Thank you for that. Very interesting conversation. I think at the beginning, Gary, you had, we've noticed that there are some questions in the chat, and I'm going to get back to those in a minute. But at the beginning, Gary, you said that it's important to think about whether or not your question is novel, timely, actionable, is it catalytic? And Anita, you and I are talking about it's important that we think about addressing some of the problems that actually have an impact or a social impact in the world because they're important problems. Now, this is very, if you were going to give some advice to a junior scholar, a PhD student, or someone who's early in their career, how will they identify these problems? It's very, as Gary also said, there are very big problems, and probably not one organization can solve it. There's, we have to think about more institutional solutions to solve some of these big problems, collaboration across different types of organizations.
Yeah.
So what kind of, where do you start as a young scholar? What kind of research questions do you go for if you want to have impact?
So first of all, it's what Gary talks about is very compelling and sensible, and I agree. Let me just offer a few thoughts here. So one thing I think doesn't work, is to take kind of an established theory that emerged and evolved in over the course of the development of the field. And I'll just give you an example. Let's say a theory of one of Michael Porter, my mentor's sort of ideas about competitive advantage, say, and the ways in which it emerges as involving either low cost or differentiation strategies within an industry structure that's well circumscribed and easy to observe, and taking some sort of claim that has emerged in the theory over the years. Let's say the idea that the cost structure of an organization is exogenously conferred, and therefore the choice is simply to get an aligned approach to competitive advantage, and then seek to measure performance or explain performance by with that theory, and then do something like say, well, performance, in my view, is going to be more than only, let's say, return on invested capital for a company. It's going to be also, I'm going to look at its social impact in elevating, let's say, or in elevating inclusion, or its social impact in terms of pollution reduction or something like that. In other words, the idea of like kind of throwing some sort of a social impact variable into a pot that primarily consists of theory that developed under a paradigmatic approach in the field of strategy that emphasized a unit of analysis at the level of the firm, and saw the primary purpose of our field is explaining heterogeneity in financial performance of firms. That way of thinking is not going to get you to impact at the level, certainly, that Gary is describing and that I hope to kind of try to convey. Okay. We need lots of new theory. We need to know how to think about systems. If we have, let me just say, this is kind of a little bit of a kind of current passion of mine. If we drive for identification in every single stinking publication, we miss system level problems. You can't, in a system, everything's complicit. So if you insist that you isolate the one thing that could be the lever to actionable insight, you're ruling out the complicity of the system in which a firm, let's say, is embedded, or an NGO or the governmental agency is embedded, where the whole structure of the system is the problem, right? There's a lot of great work on this in the field already here. So we need a new way of thinking about system level effects. We need new ways of thinking about trade-offs between different types of social impact goals. Like, for example, sometimes when you elevate economic performance, you also amplify inequality. Or when you think a lot about reducing pollution, you actually make a firm inefficient compared to its peers. Or you may create inequities in community impact through, you pollute here in order to be able to not pollute there, that kind of stuff. So there's lots of work that we need to do to try to understand relationships between different types of goals, as another example. So for me, there's a lot of ways to contribute to impact. You could be a theorist and try to think about those things. You could be a practice-oriented, actionable insight, translational research scholar, such as perhaps some of Gary's friends at Stanford that are running those labs that are trying to get new medicines or new medical devices or new procedures out of those insights about, nuclear science or whatever they're doing. Or you can be an empiricist that's testing theory, both established and new theory, for its robustness, or phenomenologically trying to kind of generate new insights. And I think we should have a big tent in the field and allow lots and lots of different routes to impact, including impact on each other as scholars. I don't want to close the door on anything other than making, more unhealthy food. Like I once told my dean, I can't teach the Coke Pepsi case anymore. I just can't. I can't help my students learn how to sell more stuff that's bad for you. I can't do it anymore. And I feel similarly about trying to keep alive theory that you can kind of smell, taste, and feel is not robust. It's not capturing the essential character of a situation. And, so it's not that I love everything, but I do want to have a big tent for what we understand as impact in the field of strategy. And Gary, just briefly to mention, you might be interested to hear that the mission of the Academy of Management is to support scholars and scholarship. It's not to have practical insights. I mean, it doesn't reject practical insights, but its mission is to support a scholarly path to them.
Yeah. Well, somewhere on the Academy's website, it does say the Academy's mission is to advance the profession of management. I don't know. I'm sure the latter is probably also true and probably more central. But I guess all I'm arguing is those two things are not, shouldn't be at all mutually exclusive. I think that I think that there are 20 in the United States. There's about 20 million people with a managerial role, and another about 7 million who are in administrative functions. And I don't know, maybe a few hundred of them are part of the Academy of Management. So clearly most of them do not think that this is the work that's being done is particularly helpful to them. There's another barometer on that as well that I find very interesting. In the United States, companies spend about $5 billion a year supporting university research. And if you look at where that money goes, and I could pull up a slide here, but I probably won't. But if you look at where that money goes, a lot of it goes to life sciences, to computing science, to engineering. A lot of it now goes to the environment. But of that 5 billion, less than 100 million goes to management research. And it's basically the same ratio when you look at where the government's spending goes. And so, what the people and within business schools, we fund more of our own research than almost any other part of the university. And, there are a lot of explanations, a lot of ways of interpreting that. And maybe I'm tending to take a more confrontational way. But to me, what a lot of these institutions, who, by the way, have a huge interest in advancing science in all ways for the good of humanity, not only for their own bottom line, is what they are saying to a lot of management scholars is you are irrelevant, right? We don't think you're doing work that is really going to make a difference. So, so what's my advice to young scholars then? Couple of things. Number one, see where the problems of society and the incapacities of organizations overlap. So, you can't solve every, as a management researcher, I'm not going to solve the problem of human beings wanting to drink sugary drinks, right? Now I can choose not to teach those cases, but, the implications and, but what I can solve is I can help build healthcare institutions that are better at dealing with that, or I can help build institutions that have a higher purpose and will take on that challenge. By myself, I'm not going to change our propensity, for sugar. I'm not going to invent Ozempic or whatever. So I think you start by looking at, okay, what are the problems in society? And then what are the limits within our institutions that kind of contribute to that? And which of those should I be tackling on? One of the great benefits I had early in my career was to be friends with C.K. Prahalad. And he wasn't on my dissertation committee. I never took a class from him, but we ended up collaborating over many, many years. And C.K. was deeply contrarian. In every conversation, every meeting, he would be asking, like, what is nobody talking about? What are the taken for granted assumptions that are not on the table? What are the issues that are too painful for people even to address? And I think, super important work for any young scholar is to identify an interesting problem, right? And I 100% agree with what you're saying, Anita. Another very good piece of advice I got when I was still a PhD student from CK is he said, and I'd been advised by one of my faculty colleagues when I was a young PhD student. He says, Gary, find a theory that's kind of already there, as you were describing, Anita. Test it in some new contexts. See if you get 3 or 4 academic articles in the first few years, and then go from there. And CK said to me, and it was also my own inclination, if I do that, I'm lost forever. Like, I'm going to be there building on other people's theories in an incremental way with very little new to say. And yes, it is a higher risk, strategy probably to do something else. But golly, if, early in your career, you have to find a problem that you think, is kind of worth solving. And when CK and I first started writing, I was based at the University of Michigan. I was doing my PhD. He was there as a young faculty. We could see, the U.S. auto companies for the first time, a big U.S. industry was getting pummeled by its foreign competitors. And we knew that the problem was not cost structure, and the problem was not, the problem was management and myopia and sloth and so on. And so I think that's, for me, one secret is try to find an interesting problem at that intersection of societal challenges and institutional, limits and so on. The other thing I would say to a young scholar is really work hard at developing that contrarian point of view. I think it was Thomas Kuhn. He said, all significant breakthroughs are breaks with old ways of thinking. And virtually everything we know about organizations that we think we know, right? Whether you read, administrative behavior from Simon, whether it's behavioral theory of the firm, Sider March, whether it's the effective executive, Drecker, whether it's the nature of managerial work, Mintzberg, you go down through the whole corpus of the most influential works on management, all of them, everything we learned came from inside of organizations that fit a 19th century bureaucratic template, every single bit of it. And so we assume you need 8 levels, right, in an organization to manage a large organization. You don't. We assume that a lot of jobs are not going to be, very inspiring. We assume that internal resource allocation will be highly politicized, and whatever, as Joe Bauer argued, and so on. None of those things are necessary. But if everything we've learned comes from inside, we're like a group of economists who spent our entire lives inside of a planned economy and never saw an alternative. And I remember 20 years ago having a conversation with Jim March here in my office in California. And I said, Jim, do you think we can ever kind of build organizations that are fundamentally more capable? He said, no. And I thought, that's horrible. We invented these things as human beings. Maybe we can reinvent them. But to start out by just saying, no, this is the way organizations are, and these are inbuilt propensities, and we can't change them. Golly, that's like a horrible way to think. But you only get out of that if you're willing to kind of challenge those paradigmatic beliefs, if you're willing to be a little bit of a contrarian, and importantly, if you're looking in places others aren't. So that's my advice to, a lot more advice, but that'd be a couple of things. Make sure you're in the thrall of an interesting problem, and make sure you're looking where other people aren't, and, you know, kind of plotting your own course.
Thank you. I think this brings me a little bit. Victor had an interesting question in the chat because we've talked a lot now about impact being about thinking about societal problems and how organizations can make a difference, solving problems. I don't know, Victor, if you want to unmute and ask your question, but I saw that you were asking a little bit more about whether or not impact is always something that has to be outside the organization, or it can also be internal. Is that correct? You're still muted.
Could you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
now we can hear you.
Hello. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm a practitioner from strategy consulting, and now I'm doing a PhD because I'm moving to academia. This discussion is very interesting for me because usually we could categorize strategy as a two-type strategies, adapting to the environment and shaping something that's around us. Yeah. And in our discussion, we're talking about this more or less collective strategy to tackle big social challenges and shape external environment. So this is mainly collective strategy, because when we're talking about strategy as institution-based view approach, based on that, to change something at the big scale, yeah, change thinking about it. So this is a very, very challenging, and I would distinguish this position, this paradigmatic view and practice and inside academia, strategic management academia, and strategy management practice. And there is a big, I would say, issue of duality, because when we're talking about the strategy as a potential solutions, and then what we see as implemented solution, between there is a big difference, like between the idea and actions, and between action and outcome. And always we have noise, we have some other issues that ideal type of goal achievement, it's not possible, a lot of issues. So I would ask maybe, as it's my final year of a PhD, I'm also focused on the issue of Euro integration as a context. So could you maybe come back to this distinction between strategic level and operational level? Because this is like top down, bottom up, because everything without this practice or with some practical empirical data, it's still not relevant. Yeah, we are looking for relevance and impact, and they come together. But this duality, it's like a sword. So this is, for me, it's an issue when we are more operational and when we're more strategic. The problem is it's everything could be strategic. So how could you suggest to distinguish what is really strategic level, what is maybe business model or operational one, when we are tackling grand challenges? So this, thank you.
Thank you, Victor.
Yeah, please go ahead, Anita. That's a big question.
It certainly is. It's a little bit your sweet spot, Gary. I mean, both are so important. We need both strategic and operational insights. I think our journals are a little rarefied now with regard to the emphasis on for publication on the development of bodies of knowledge that are well established within the kind of corpus of what we're doing. And anybody that's taught strategic management, such as, or live the, walk the talk as you have, will tell you that management, the kinds of problems that face, chief executives that face divisional leaders, that face strategists, that face operational leaders, are ambiguous and complicated and full of ambiguity, and that if you had a theory that told you what to do, you should use it. But most of the time, the situation doesn't fit the theory. There is distance between what is practically relevant, certainly as manifest for most of us in our teaching, right? Trying to teach young people how to be strategists and to be operationally effective as strategists, to make decisions based on the best available information as opposed to comprehensive theory about what to do. There is some distance between that imperative and the research studies that we write, where we're so concerned about selection and instrumentation and causal claims that we wouldn't dare make prescriptions for practice. So the problem you're pointing to, Victor, I think is a real one. But people who survive in our profession, I think, like Louisa, like Gary, like Julia, and like you will, find a way to feel comfortable in that space. And there's not just one way to do that. I think Gary has found a spectacularly effective way to do that. So maybe you could say a little bit more, Gary, about how you handle that tension, if you're up for it.
Yeah. I mean, two quick reflections. One specifically to your question, Victor, and one a little bit more framing. You know, when I arrived at London Business School, my PhD was in international business, and I thought I was going to be teaching international economics and things like that. And I was asked to teach, like, with about a 3 weeks notice, the course strategy course. And luckily, Michael Porter was there, and I could like borrow probably the Coke Pepsi case. I don't know if it existed all those years ago, but Kodak, Polaroid, whatever the heck they were, right? And I didn't use his textbook and so on, but I used a bunch of his cases. But what was clear to me, you know, thinking, and again, with this penchant to always say, well, what are the other problems or the other interesting things that are here? I had no interest in doing what Michael Porter did, because I would never do it better than he did, right? He did it as good as anybody could ever do that. But, you know, as I understood it, and Anita will correct me if I'm mischaracterizing, you know, he was really trying to understand, why do you see persistent profit differences between organizations, and how do you account for that? And he kind of reverse engineered industrial economics and helped us understand that. So you could see, like, what, you know, why are some extant strategies more effective than others? There were two questions to me that I found equally interesting. One was, well, where did these strategies come from in the first place? Right. And so I spent a couple of years talking at that time to the world's top kind of business innovators, people. So this shows you how long ago it was. Michael Dell and Anita Roddick and, you know, Mark, who's the guy who invented the browser, come back to me, Mark Andreessen. Because that was what I was really interested in. Like, you know, we all live in the same world with the same data. Why does somebody come up with a game-breaking strategy and nobody else does, or not that straight? And I knew for damn sure it didn't come from strategic planning. That was like, you know, that's like an oxymoron. That had like nothing to do with creating a strategy. The second interesting question to me was, all right, how do you change a strategy when it, passes its sell-by date? When a strategy loses its economic effectiveness, as it become deeply embedded in rituals and thinking and processes and whatever, how do you uninstall, right, a strategy, which many organizations have struggled with? So those are questions that I spent a lot of time thinking about and playing with, and were interesting to me as well, but couldn't have done it without the foundations of Michael Porter, right? So that was like super symbiotic. So I think, again, I just come back to this thing, like, try to find the questions that are kind of new and different and not like already overpopulated in the literature. The other thing, to your particular question about strategy, I've often thought that it's a complete mistake to draw a distinction between strategy formulation and implementation. I think that is just kind of nonsense. And if you go back and read even some very early work, Bob Bergelman and others, they found that strategies emerged and often low in the organization, and people would be skeptical, and maybe you'd run an experiment and you try things, and at some point they kind of get endorsed. But what we know empirically is that top-down planning and strategy processes very, very seldom produce game-changing strategy. They just don't. I mean, that's I think beyond debate. And so, the way I've handled that in my career, and I've written about it and so on, is I see the strategy process as this very deep company-wide real-time conversation about where are our opportunities, where are we going? And I think senior executives are editors. They're not strategy creators. They don't have enough bandwidth, enough imagination, enough data, whatever. They're living too far from the fringe where things are changing. They literally cannot be the the authors of strategy. I mean, and when they try to be like Mark Zuckerberg with the metaverse, it usually doesn't work. Or oppositely, like Intel, you hang on to an old model long past, it's whatever. So I think, I see the implementation and the formulation as this completely kind of, circular process where you have theses about what might work and you try them and you see if they create value and if they whatever, and then you might double down on that or not. But, where I've acted more as a consultant and tried to create strategy, we often have 5,000, 10,000, 70,000 people involved in that conversation. Because I believe fundamentally that you cannot produce unusual returns without starting with a foundation of unusual insights, and that the probability of finding any truly great strategy is arithmetically dependent upon the number of options you create in the first place. That's one thing you learn in Silicon Valley, right? 10,000 companies, 1,000 get venture funding, and 5 of them become unicorns, right? Like, and there's no way to change that logic inside of a large organization. There's no way for some smart people to come together and say, let's just go find that $1 billion, like, can't be done. Once a generation, you find a CEO that might be smart enough to do it. But so I think strategy creation is an iterative process that goes between imagination and testing. And yeah, that's enough for now. But
thank you very much, Gary and Anita. Felipe Sousa, you've had some interesting questions in the chat, but I think a really pertinent question right now is this question you have about the values of the scholar in the strategy development process. I don't know if you want to unmute and ask the question, or if you would like me to. Felipe, you want to unmute? Otherwise, I can read out.
Yeah, it'd be helpful to expand on that a moment if you can. Or maybe
he doesn't want to unmute. Okay, so I will read out. So his question is whether or not the scholarly values or beliefs play any role in the development process and outcomes of strategic management research. And if so, can or should one intervene in the relationship between values and impact?
So maybe if it's okay, Louisa,
Yeah, please go ahead.
I'll jump in. I think that everything we do has a moral dimension and an ethical dimension. Being a business school professor is an ethical decision. Brushing your teeth in the morning is an ethical decision, although it's a relatively trivial one. I mean, it's trivial for me because I just feel so privileged that I can brush my teeth in the morning. If I thought about it a lot, I might realize that for others, it may involve some kinds of choices about allocation of funds, for example, that some people don't have, that can't make comfortably. But every dimension, from the conceptualization of a problem area, as Gary has been saying, to the conceptualization of a research question, an intention for your research program, all the way through to the way you handle the execution of your projects, the way you write your papers, the way you conduct your analysis. All of this has moral dimensions. It's also equally true that every action that a manager takes, it rests on values and beliefs, and that those values and beliefs play a tremendous role in, it's interesting, in both the macro and micro ways in which a person who's in a leadership role would act. The kinds of things you respond to, the ways in which you the ways in which you frame problems. There's a interesting line of research we don't have time to talk about, Gary, but maybe next time you and I run into each other, we can talk it over, which is, how do you even frame the problem in the first place? Has a moral dimension to it, and involves an analytical perspective. So everything, your question, Felipe, is so relevant that it's got a tremendous scope to it. There isn't a singular answer to the question of how one should intervene in the relationship between values and impact. Each of us has to. The one thing I can tell you is that everything I write I believe I try to make sure that I believe that it's actually true. And I've learned that sometimes later I will find out it's not. And half of what I write is probably wrong. And if I knew which half, I wouldn't write it. It's not so clear exactly why or how it might be wrong. Sometimes there's an elephant in the room, or a gorilla, somebody in a gorilla suit on a basketball court that I can't see. Okay. But I do try, both as a manager and as a scholar, to make sure that I've got at least some alignment there between the envelope of contribution to society that my profession aspires to as a manager or as a scholar, and the integrity I bring to the role. And I don't know that that's readily measurable among managers, or even certainly among scholars. It's a tremendous detriment to our profession when we find people cheating in their research programs. It's devastating for our culture when people lose faith in science, because scientists are exploitative of the scientific stature that we have to publish things that are faked. It's equally devastating when managers exploit for personal gain, or are fraudulent or corrupt. There's great research to do on how that happens and why and how it occurs. So you're raising a tremendous array of questions that I think are very important, and there's no simple answer to. And it's 2 o'clock, so I apologize for going over.
That's all right. Thank you, Anita. But we have time for a few more questions. Gary, did you want to
Can I just add one thing to that? Because I definitely agree with what Anita said. I think, values are somewhat relevant, as we all know, and, we're having a lot of quite fraught conversations in many societies now about which values predominate and why and how they're expressed and so on. So I think one has to be kind of careful about kind of putting your own particular perspective in, which doesn't mean you don't need to wrestle with this. I would just maybe say slightly different way. For me, one of the things that I think gives you that imbues your research with humanity and also gives you more impact is compassion. And if you start, whatever phenomenon you're looking at, if you try to think like, who's influenced by this, whose lives are affected by this, what is their reality, and you try to truly inhabit that, I think your research is more productive. But I also think it's just going to be a more powerful experience for you, and you're going to have more impact in that. And if you're not kind of frustrated, or if you don't have a level of kind of moral indignation about a few things that are going on, you're probably not awake. And if that's not informing your research, that is probably a bit of a challenge. I look at things, let me give you just a few data points that have like super energized, my work, at least inside my own mind. One is the fact that in the United States, and this is now becoming true in much of the world, every generation since the Second World War, a smaller percentage has gotten into the middle class. Like, you could not have free democratic societies without a strong middle class, and we're losing that, and we have to understand why. Another data point. For years and years and years, Gallup has showed us that basically only 20% of employees around the world are fully engaged in their work. That's like, how do you wake up as a manager or as an academic in like every day? How are you okay with that? Like, how can that possibly be okay? And none of what we've been doing, whether it's mindfulness training or agile teams or employee brands, none of what we've been doing has been changing that reality. None of it. If you look at another reality, for the last 30 years, despite all the investment in technology, right? We are now spending $5 trillion a year on information technology in the global economy. And AI is accelerating that. Despite that, we've had 30 years of declining productivity growth. which means we are unable to afford programs for healthcare, for environment, for defense, for other critical things. It means that income inequality goes up. It means social divisions go up. It means we have, more whatever. And if in management we're not asking, and by the way, I can tell you the largest institutions in the United States are now net drag on growth of U.S. productivity, despite their size, because the biggest proportion of their profits now comes from markups and oligopolistic power, not from innovation. That's empirical results. Not to be frustrated by that, not to be upset by that, not to say, guys, we have to solve this thing. So I think if you are not driven by what you see as kind of fundamental challenges for society and problems that don't reflect some sense of our accountability, our responsibility to those around us, I don't think you can have a lot of impact as a researcher, to be perfectly honest.
Thank you to you both. We have a last question from Lucas. He's had his hand up very patiently for a while. Let's take that and then we can round up.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me. I have a question to both Anita and Gary. You guys said a lot of things about the trust, entrepreneurship, community, that side of the strategic management. Now, there is not much said about the other side of the strategic management, which is conservation, power, crisis, all that kind of a stuff. So the power perspective, not the social perspective of the strategic management. So how we, as a young, and don't be mistaken by my gray hair, I'm also a young researcher. I consider myself. How we can approach in a more complex way, systematic way, like you, Gary, would like to, and try to make a change impact and contribute to the science value creation. What would be the theories? What would be the lenses we should look through to have a little bit more, again, complex approach to the questions or the dilemmas which we are facing? I have in mind, for example, a complexity theory, but maybe there is something else what we should use in our research and utilize to describe the problems we are facing. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Lucas.
There's a strong, Lucas, thank you. There's a strong line of work in strategy that reflects insights from organization theory on power directly. A lot of the work that's done on decision making and teams, and there's a strong thread in human resource management and in brushes on things like tapping motivations, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations, thinking about classical bureaucratic theory and organization theory. So there's some, a pretty robust body of strong theoretical work on power itself. Power, I think, the construct itself of power is, I think, of great interest. Gary, remember back in the 90s when we were going, market power as an economic construct was not really interrogated. We took for granted that oligopoly or monopoly would deliver it without really thinking about what it was or how it would get used. So there's still quite a bit of scope, I think, Lucas, for more contribution to try to understand how power is exercised and so on. But let me also let me respond to what I believe is at the heart of your interests based on how you framed your question. There's an area of work at the Academy of Management in critical management studies, and there are quite a few scholars in strategy that are registered cross membership with critical management studies. For example, Paul Adler, former president of the Academy, that bring a critical lens to some of the theories that we have that consider that. There's also, I think, a very interesting stream of work on coercion and coercive violence. work that's on how companies, for example, I have this paper with Greg Distelhorst that came out in Org Science in 2023 that looks at how suppliers to large multinationals that are primarily selling stuff in the United States, the UK, and other high-income countries are pushing back into their supply chain some practices that may be coercive, like forced labor. I mentioned Joe's working on forced labor. There is work that is related to power that you could look at. That's pretty wonderful, pretty amazing. So cheer up, I think, is my message. There is work on this in this vein in the field, and much more to do.
Thank you, Anita. It sounds like you're ending on a positive note.
It's hard to end on a positive note when you're talking about forced labor and exploitation.
That's true. But we've been talking about impact in strategic management, and I think some of the things you've said have sounded like you're a little bit pessimistic about our field. I don't know. Can we end on a positive note? Are you optimistic in terms of the outlook for the field of strategic management in terms of thinking about impact? Or
1000%. I mean, what we're doing is following the example of great scholars like Gary Hamel and you, Louise, in kind of getting real about what the big problems are in our societies today and how organizations can be deployed to be effective in constructing solutions, creating value, solving problems that are of great importance. And we're getting better and better by the day at how to understand what that impact is, how solutions to problems can create new problems, how we can anticipate that better, how we can understand the legacy of the past more thoughtfully, how we can connect with scholars in cognate disciplines and in related disciplines more effectively. And, there's nothing that keeps me more inspired than the next generation of scholars that, frankly, I think, Gary, I don't know if you agree, come to the field with incredible problems that they want to solve. And what we need to do, I think, as their mentors and senior friends, is enable you to do that. Our generation is leaving your generation with a lot more problems than we should have, and we need to help you do the work you want to do. Sorry.
No. I'm sorry. I started to talk before I was finished listening. Yeah, I think, I think we know as much as we need to know about power in organizations, right? Like, God bless you if you want to do one more thing on that, but we know as much as we need to know. The challenge is, how do we change it? And that's where I want to shift. I would hope that over time we shift from description to innovation. How are you going to change the way people get promoted? How are you going to change? I wrote years ago about, how do you create, and it's in my most recent book, Humanocracy. How do you completely decouple positional power from influence and competence? Because they are not correlated. We know that. We have gobs of research on that. Gallup will tell you that the thing that correlates highest with a disengaged employee is the way their manager treats them. Well, if 80% of employees are disengaged, we are not going to change 80% of managers. We're not going to give them like a character makeover. What we have to understand is, what is the power relationship that exists when you control somebody's career and their compensation? That thing has to change in every organization. So I think, we have a lot of amazing research that the question is, what are you going to do? How are we going to change the way strategy gets created? It cannot be created top down. How are we going to change resource allocation? How are we going to change promotion? How are we going to change decision rights? And those things require new solutions, new practices. One final little thought on this, which I'll share a little bit more when at the annual meeting in Chicago. What you see in a lot of other disciplines now is large-scale collaborative research around these really difficult problems. That was the Human Genome, it's the Human Cell Project, and so on. I still think too often in management, you have individual scholars, underfunded, working in their own tiny little silo, trying to create their idiosyncratic language and build their own little reputation, which is not going to cut it in the face of these problems, right? We need entirely new research structures that are far more collaborative. if you look at the paper that came out of CERN and the ATLAS experiments there that confirmed the Higgs boson, that paper had 5,000 signatures on, 5,000 names on it, right? Like, guys, like, we have to be thinking about this. Like, it's not going to happen with us, like, beavering away by by ourselves. So, yeah, that's another topic, but I think we need more innovation in our research, more for sure. And I think we need probably more collaborative research that allows us to collectively address bigger problems with more impact.
Thank you so much, Gary. What a great way to end this discussion. And as you said, I look forward to hearing more from you at the plenary in Chicago. So I hope all of you will come and join the discussion then. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Gary. Great conversation. Very interesting. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you for all the participants for being here and interacting with us.